Hello, welcome back. This is another screencast coming at you from the camper in Minnesota. We're going to talk about part two of Mexico's beginnings. We're learning Mexico's history so that we can be informed about the present and put ourselves. We're going to put ourselves in the shoes of modern Mexicans and think about the future from their perspective. So we got to know what's on their mind about their past. So this is part two. There are only two parts to Mexico's beginnings. So in part one, we already talked about four pre-Spanish periods with the Olmecs, the Mayans, and the Aztecs. And now we're going to talk about what happens when the Spanish show up and after the Spanish show up. So let's pull this up. Keep in mind our essential questions for our Mexico unit. What principles should guide the development of Mexico's economy? How should Mexico define its relationship with the United States? How should it define its relationship with the rest of the world? And how should Mexicans address their country's inequality and poverty? And this last question is really important. In order to address the inequality and the poverty, we have to know how it got there and why it got there. So we're going to talk about that a little bit in this screencast. Okay, so when the Spanish show up, they show up in 1517. And the Spanish had already been in the Caribbean islands for like 20 years or 25 years from when Columbus landed in 1492. They already had enslaved indigenous peoples on these islands. And a lot of the indigenous peoples had been wiped out by disease. So the Spanish are running out of labor. So they go to Mexico looking to enslave more people. And when I say indigenous people, that term is important. It's a big word, indigenous. That means native people who are conquered by outsiders. So in Montana, the indigenous people are the Native Americans. In Mexico, it was the Mayans and Aztecs who were the indigenous people. In Australia, the indigenous people are the Aborigines. There are indigenous people all over the globe. 2 years after the Spanish originally show up, Cortez shows up in 1519, and he is specifically looking to conquer the capital of the Aztecs, which is Tenochtitlan. He knows he can't do this on his own. He doesn't have that many people, and the Aztecs are a sophisticated civilization with a sophisticated military. But I don't know if you remember when I was talking about the Aztecs, they didn't rule the people they conquered directly. They just demanded taxes, and they demanded that the other groups would send in people to be sacrificed. So these other groups didn't like the Aztec conquerors. So the Spanish show up and they work with these other groups and they build allies. And together they all attack the Aztecs. The fighting lasts for like 3 years. The Spanish take over the city and then they lose it and then they take it and they lose it. And the fighting goes back and forth. But after 3 years, a couple of things that happened during the 3 years. At one point, the Spanish have the capital city and they massacre about 9,000 nobles. There's also a smallpox outbreak, which kills about 40% of the Aztec population. Which maybe you're thinking, oh, no big deal, 40%. They still have 60%. But if 40% of your population is killed, that's people that bake bread. That's people that herd sheep and cows and bring you chickens and make all your food. And so it's not just that 40% of the soldiers died, it's all the people who make the civilization work. The moms, the grandparents, everybody cooking, building things. So 40% really can collapse a culture in a major way. As I mentioned before, when they do the fighting, the indigenous allies of the Spanish outnumber the Spanish fighters 200 to 1. So there's a lot more to the fighting than just some Spanish guys showing up and winning the battle. They have a lot of help from the natives. They do end up winning the fight, though, and they colonize Mexico. Mexico becomes an official colony in 1535. Um, they have a lot of frontier wars. The Spanish keep bringing more people over, and they try to expand the territory they can control. So there's frontiers wars. There's indigenous resistance, Aztecs and Mayans who are still fighting. But after about 140 years, Mexico is the wealthiest, most populated Spanish colony. It's like the best colony of Spain is Mexico. So, who lives there? There's a mix of people, the mix of cultures. You have the European cultures, the Spanish, the indigenous cultures, the Mayan and the Aztecs who still live there, and they're bringing over African slaves. So you have this mix of cultures where ideas are being exchanged, foods, music, people are intermarrying. So all of that's going on for that period. There does become a racial hierarchy in Mexico, and this affects who owns land, what kind of jobs you have, can you be a government, can you work in the government, can you have a job in the military. So the hierarchy is that white people born in Spain are the most elite. White people born in Mexico are like a notch below them. They're called criollos. So it's peninsulares are the whites born in Spain. Criollos are the whites born in Mexico. Mestizos are the mixed race, which there's a very large population of mestizos. The indigenous peoples, those are the original Aztecs and Mayans who are still there. And then the African slaves are the lowest group in the Mexican racial hierarchy. Okay, so what else is going on in colonial Mexico? The economy is doing great. There's a lot of gold and silver in Mexico, and the two elite groups, the two white groups, are owning all of the gold mines and silver mines and cacao plantations. And the slaves and the indigenous people are doing all of the hard labor. By the way, cacao is what makes chocolate. It grows on bushes or trees. I can't remember exactly what it grows on, but you take the nuts out or you take the seeds out, and that's what makes chocolate. So that was a big export for Mexico when it was a colony. The Catholic Church is also super important to Mexican history. When the conquistadors were doing their conquering, they would often say they're doing it to help convert people to Christianity. That was oftentimes their justification for violence. Many indigenous groups did convert to Christianity, but they kept a lot of their native practices. So traditional healers might still use traditional herbs for healing, but they would be Christian. There's tradition, the Day of the Dead was an Aztec tradition, and that is still practiced by a lot of Catholics. You may have seen the kids' movie Coco about the Day of the Dead in Mexico. Anyway, very good movie. So today, 90% of Mexicans identify as Catholic, which is a very high percentage. So when did Mexico get its independence? It's a colony for a long time. It gets its independence in 1821. But the story of their independence starts with Napoleon. I don't know if you remember world history, but he's this French dude who becomes the Emperor of France, and he's fighting all these battles all over Europe, and one of the things he does is he conquers Spain. And when he conquers Spain, he puts the king in jail, and the Spanish legislature writes this new constitution that gives a lot more power to the people. Back then it was called a liberal constitution, but it's very different from modern liberals. Back then liberals wanted like freedom of religion, freedom of speech. That's what liberal meant back then. So the Spanish legislature wants to give more power to people, more freedom to people. In Mexico, the elites don't want that. The Peninsulares and the other group of whites, they don't want to give more power to the indigenous people or the mestizos or the slaves. So, In Mexico, there are a couple of failed uprisings. The mestizos and the indigenous people have these uprisings, but they get put down and the leaders get killed by the authorities in Mexico. Then the rich conservatives in Mexico, they don't want these reforms that are coming out of Spain. They want a king. They want Catholic to be the official church. They declare independence from Spain. There's a little bit of fighting, but Spain doesn't have it in them to have a big fight. So Mexico gets its independence in 1821. I want to emphasize it's an entirely different type of independence than in the U.S. In the U.S., we were talking about freedom of religion and freedom of speech and more voting and more like a constitution with powers in a legislature, powers in a Supreme Court. In Mexico, it was a independence declared by the rich white people so that they could continue to be majority landowners and majority business owners, and so that they wouldn't have uprisings from other groups. So that's going to play out in terms of why Mexico is the way it is in the present. All right, after independence, Mexico is happy to be its own country, but they don't have a real good, solid government that has a solid authority over the country. You can see how big Mexico is here. All of this green was Mexico. A lot of what is currently the United States was not the United States. In the first few years, there was a big disease, wiped out about 600,000 people. A lot of wealthy people ended up leaving Mexico, and they took their money and their investments with them. So the gold mines and the silver mines were hurting a little bit. The peasants, the indigenous people, the slaves kept working for elite white landowners, so that didn't change much. The government had a lot of military coups. The leaders were supposed to be elected, but there was a military coup, and a coup is when a small group of people overthrows the government. So in the first 50 years, most of the leaders only lasted 1 year, and most of them were overthrown, coup after coup after coup. There was also weak control over the northern territories, the lands bordering the United States. There's some conflict with Texas. The United States offered to buy some of the land that is New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Mexico refused. This is in the 1840s. Mexico refuses to sell. We invade Mexico. We capture the capital. And then we force them to sign a peace treaty where they do end up selling us all of the land that is California, New Mexico, Arizona, and some other land up there as well. So that is what happens after independence for Mexico. It's not a great start to their country. It's characterized by instability and hardship. Okay. By the way, we call that war the Mexican-American War. They call it the invasion of. Wait. I'm spacing on the name, but they call it something different, and I think they call it the invasion of the United States. All right, that's it for part 2. See me if you have any questions or email me, and that is a wrap.